This is an in-depth introduction into pivot tables. If you want a quick introduction to pivot tables, I highly recommend the one by Google. It's about 1 minute and 35 seconds. This video is an in-depth view of pivot tables, and we'll be using a class example that'll teach the fundamentals of a pivot. It'll cover rows versus columns, filtering, sorting. We'll do a quick example of using another tool, how to do it in Excel, some dangers that pivot tables present, and the do's and don'ts. Lastly, I'll show a quick example of unpivot. Quick example of a class schedule spreadsheet. It has things like a term, a year, a class, and credits, and you can see it has several rows for each. The first thing I like to do is come in here and freeze the first row, so when you look around you can see the columns. And then the next thing I like to do is add a filter, so you can filter down to specific rows in the spreadsheet. Next, I like to create a useful sum at the top, which will sum up all of the credits in the entire sheet. Now, sum works all the time regardless of what filters you have enabled. So I like to also set up a subtotal, which only totals up the visible rows after filtering, and we'll demo that here in a minute. Now, subtotal has a couple of different functions that you can enable based on the magical code. For example, 1 is an average, and what we're interested in is number 9, which is a sum, and we're going to suggest that we want to sum or subtotal everything in the credits column. You'll notice without a filter they both read 87, but if we filter down to just one year, the sum will be 87 and the subtotal is 24. You can see as we change the filter here, the subtotal will change and the sum remains the same. Now, none of this had anything to do with pivot tables, but is a useful construct for me to demo what a pivot table does do. Okay, now let's create a pivot table. And we start by selecting all of the columns that we want to pivot on. Go to Data, and then Pivot Table. This creates a new tab called Pivot Table 7 in this case that's empty. And you'll notice on the rows there's an Add Row option that correlates to each column in the spreadsheet. So if we add the year, a unique list of each year will be displayed once and only once. Now for the values, I like to add a count of, in this case, the classes, but actually it should be a count A, which will count the number of rows for that year. So in the case of 2016, it's 6, and basically if we go into the rows here and we highlight all the ones with 2016, you'll notice there are 6 of them, and if we go to 2017 and count the number of rows, there are 12, and if we go back to the pivot table, you notice there's 12. So what's nice about the values is it's counting up the number of records for each year. Now I'm going to add the term as an option, and now there are both a year and a term. If we collapse up the years here, you can see that the term is embedded within the year. Another option, rather than adding them as rows, is to move the field to the column section, in which case it doesn't expand anymore and it becomes a column at the top. So now you can see there's no expansion. Each term is now a column. We're displaying the number of classes in each term for each year. Instead of the number of classes, we might want to total up the number of credit hours. So if we add credit and it's already set to sum, we'll now see the credit hours by each year for each term. And if we want, we can bring back the number of classes at the same time by putting both fields. Now you could see that both the credits and the number of classes for each term and each year are displayed at the same time. Now this is for all rows. So we may want to come in and filter this down to a certain sub-filter, and you go into the filter here and choose, for example, a class, and choose just specific kinds of classes. So, and all the unique classes are listed here. So for example, we can clear it and just say maybe all we care about are math classes. So by typing in a partial search, we're now filtering it down to just math classes in each year for each term. Okay, let's remove the filter and check out another feature. The first thing I'd like to do here is we'll remove the class here to just show some of the credit hours. And now we're going to show how we can sort the result. So as you can see here by year, it's sorted ascending. You can change that to descending, or we'll put it back to ascending. Instead of sorting it by year, we can sort it by the, for example, grand total. So it's now sorted instead by the largest number of credit hours by year. And we can change that to descending as well. Okay, so that's a quick overview of pivots using Google Sheets. What I'd like to do is now switch over and show the similar capability in a tool called pivotjs. And this is another tool that can do pivots. And what we'll do is open the same information using a comma-separated value file. And as you can see, the interface is a little bit different, but it has the same functionality. So for example, if we drop year on the left, we basically get the number of records for each year. If we drop term on the left, it's similar to what we showed earlier with the expansion and collapse of the year and term. If we put term on the top, we get essentially that pivot with the term in columns rather than rows. And rather than getting the number of classes, we can come in here and indicate that we want a sum of the credits. We'll do this as an integer sum, which will now show us the credit hours within each term and each year. And then we can even do other things like graph it very easily using the pivotjs. Okay, so then we'll show the same exact capabilities here in Excel. So we have the same exact data that I showed in Google now in Excel. And the first thing I like to do is freeze the first row and then come in here and apply a filter. I do that in every spreadsheet. And then I highlight the data that I want to pivot, and we'll go to Insert, Pivot Table here, and this basically confirms all the information we have selected, and we want to create a new worksheet. And it has, again, a slightly different interface here, but it has the field names that come from the columns, and we can drag year into rows, and you can see we have each of the rows there. And then we'll pull the credits over, and in this case here we have a sum of the credits, so that's the credit hours by year. And we can also show the number of classes per year by dragging that down into the values as well. And if we want, we can put term at the top. And you can see it looks different than the other two, but it has the same information. So quick caveats about spreadsheets that people tend to forget. Spreadsheets are all about the data. So a quick couple of do's. Make sure you always use headers in your spreadsheets. Make sure to freeze those headers and use filters. Don't hide and show rows. Use the filters. Know your formulas. For example, when to use $ and name ranges. And then be familiar with probably these most are the 6 or 7 formulas you should know. Don't format your data, normalize it. And don't use manual highlighting to mean something. Add a column that could be used in a filter. The same thing as hiding or showing rows. Use the filters. So this is an example of what not to do. On the left you see how some people may organize information for printing in a spreadsheet, like using it like a Word document, but that's not how it should be done. Here's another example where people format spreadsheets for printing and with lots of visual embellishments that make it impossible to do any kind of pivoting or reporting on it. Now there are times where it's okay to format things. For example, if you're doing financial statements or you're building sort of a configuration sheet with options, it's not necessarily a requirement to put everything into a tabular spreadsheet format. Sometimes if you get tabular data already, you can use a tool like Unpivot to get it to a format that you could then pivot later. Okay, I highly encourage you to rewind and rewatch this, as it was a very fast demonstration. But hopefully this gives you a better understanding of pivot tables and how they can give you visibility to the data in your spreadsheets.